So, over the last 20 years, public policies towards groups identified as Roma have multiplied in France. These aim to keep away those considered as undesirable migrants, but they also offer, in parallel, contractual integration to part of them. This communication aims to highlight the effects of the contradictions and paradoxes characterizing the launch and running of many inclusion policies. The data we use here are based on 2 long-term fieldworks carried out within 2 integration projects specifically implemented for Roma migrants living in shantytowns in 2 French cities. One of these projects in Bordeaux concerned Bulgarian Roma families from Pazarjic region, and the other one in Montreuil, near Paris, Romanian Roma families, mainly from Arad and Alba. This project in Montreuil was conducted between 2009 and 2015, and in Bordeaux, it started in 2010 and still continues today. Firstly, we will see that beyond these local specificities, these projects seem frequently based on stereotypical conceptions of Roma, as well as of inclusion. We will show that interactions based on these stereotypes may lead to the emergence of problematic relationships between migrant families and the public authorities, and, from the latter's point of view, to the failure of inclusion. Reversing the point of view, we will secondly light the way the target families of these projects may succeed, nevertheless, to develop different forms of local insertion, using or not resources provided by public policies, as well as personal and family resources.
That's for me. So the studies studying the design, development, and implementation of various integration projects shows that they are based on the same conceptual framework and structurally work in the same way as exclusion policies. Indeed, both of them are motivated and justified, it's not easy to see the difference sometimes, by a stereotyped perception of the Roma, and this going hand in hand, a phantasmagory conception of social integration or inclusion. In other words, it seems difficult to understand the ins and outs of inclusive policies without taking into account the policies that, at the same time, aim at keeping away Roma migrants from territory as from rights. In an exemplary way, we already find in 1990 the combination of various initiatives in order to solve the brand new gypsy issue, of which the first incarnation in France was then the shantytown of Nanterre. And we find there the tools that will be used by the public authorities to face the Roma problem during the following 25 years. That means evacuation of the settlements, expulsion to the country of origin, selective public hospitality for some families, and ignorance of many other families. Until the second part of the 2000s, the question of public hospitality concerning migrant Roma was mainly left to the initiative of local authorities. And in some 15 years, a few municipalities or départements launched integration projects combining family temporary housing and social support. And these very diverse projects were the product of local bricolage, launched by local NGOs, informal networks of voluntaries and of professionals, and supported by local representatives. And it is only from 2007-2008 that the state begins to promote a standardized, I have a problem with this word, form of project, within which the prefecture, the local state in France, plays an important financial and operational role. Those projects were gradually designated by the label Village d'Insertion, maybe you heard about this, integration villages. The standard size of these villages was defined upstream. They were supposed to accommodate 15 families or almost 100 people. The beneficiaries were selected on the basis of social diagnosis in order to distinguish within a slum the integrable ones from the others, the vast majority of the people in the slum. And during 4 or 5 years, the beneficiaries living in the village faced permanent evaluation of their progresses on the path of social integration. And some of them were excluded over time during the project. These villages d'insertion are a concrete expression of the policy of chosen immigration that dominates public debate for more than 15 years now in France as elsewhere. But they are also the embodiment of this fight against poverty, which considers the poor as responsible for its situation. In other words, they are a form of social intervention that is perfectly integrated within neoliberal governance and securitization. And they can be considered, alongside policies of exclusion, as the two sides of the same coin, namely how to resolve the problem of the presence of the Roma, perceived as intrinsically incompatible with modernity and its urban, social, cultural, and economic forms. Also, it has been promoted by the state. The model of the village d'insertion has never really spread beyond the Paris region. And many of integration projects launched during the past decade were conceived or presented as alternatives to this model for very different reasons. For example, in Montreuil, it was for political or ideological reasons. And in Bordeaux, it was for more pragmatic reasons and the will not to concentrate families in the same place. But our fieldwork led us to find many points in common in these so-called alternative projects with the logic of the village d'insertion, also in often implicit or euphemised forms. In particular, they joined them on the way in which the beneficiaries, the Roma, are apprehended, and the way social integration is defined as a unilinear and normative process. In other words, they accumulate a culturalist view of Roma and a functionalist conception of integration. And these two conceptions were to be found here on our fieldwork as elsewhere. Then 3 main registers of stereotypes can be identified in a recurring way, and it's nothing original, you'll see. 3 main fields. Roma are nomads. They belong to closed communities or even tribes or clans. And third, they have always lived in precariousness or in marginality. So first, I just come back on these stereotypes quickly, because you know them well, but it's not a pity to recall them. Nomadism. Usually, Roma international mobility is disconnected from the global migratory dynamics in Europe and is linked to a nomadic or diasporic culture. Anyway, they are not perceived as really native to the country from which they come. Then, the fact that beneficiary families of those projects usually maintain ties with their country of origin and go there occasionally or regularly is even more intolerable than with other precarious immigrants who are already globally suspected of not having a real will to integrate in France. Since Roma are neither from here nor really from out there, their movements are seen as tricks designed to conceal, if not suspicious activity, at least an inconstant and problematic way of life. Second kind of stereotypes about communitarianism. The target of these policies are usually regarded as a community, predisposed to internal solidarity and also opposed to openness to the outside world. And this community life will correspond to specific modalities for managing internal conflicts or to an alternative or even secret political organization that runs counter to the empowerment of individuals targeted by the project. Paradoxically, while denouncing these tribal practices, the actors and social workers often try to identify leaders and spokespeople in order to simplify the communication with beneficiaries. Because in fact, the mere fact of being relatives and bearing the same surnames and coming from the same villages or neighborhood does not necessarily bring a close affective or relational proximity between the families and persons. And while there are, of course, mutual help relationships between certain individuals and certain families, it seems impossible to detect any collective solidarity on a large scale, even in the same project or in the same slum. Beneficiaries spend more time denigrating their neighbors or their concurrents in the project by calling them dirty, twisted, and dishonest gypsies, Tsiganin, and so on. And in the end, social workers have difficulty grasping the contours of this community from which they try to extract individuals in order to make them autonomous, while the beneficiaries themselves manifest more will to undo this imagined community. And the third kind of stereotypes is about precarity and marginality. Roma migrants are very often perceived as not using well the project dedicated to them. And this seems incomprehensible because they are seen as the most precarious among the poor and the poor migrants. And these representations are based on a broad misunderstanding of the life trajectories of the targets of the public action. And there is a gap between the way in which the families are seen and the way they look at their migration and, more broadly, their existence. Of course, they are experiencing difficult living conditions, sometimes for many years, in France, in our case, but they had many other experiences in the past, as international circulation, wage employment for many of them, and moreover, they also experienced residential stability and local integration over several generations in the same villages or in the same neighborhoods in the homeland. So their experience of the world is far from being limited to the borders of the slum or to the borders of the integration project. Actually, the institutional actors and social workers of these projects have only a very limited knowledge of the biographies of the beneficiaries. I'm not speaking about their culture, only the biographies of the beneficiaries, even though the latter were submitted to one or several social diagnoses before and during the project. Migrants, so, are asked to develop a brand new life project conditioned to the public hospitality, which is contractual, but this brand new life project, which does not take into account their past, nor their status as person, nor their place in various social networks here in France and there, in their homeland. Transition. We have a choreography.
So in the end, in these inclusion projects, Roma are treated as a problem, as in policies of exclusion. As soon as their identity is perceived as the cause of their problems or the cause of the problems they cause, public action can only aim at re-educating them. Then, integrating Roma is to de-gypsify them. These migrants are thus approached and treated as objects, more or less refractory to the transformation, and they are never seen as subjects having their own stories, logics, strategies, resources, even when some projects present themselves as militants or alternatives, as in Montreuil, or that the term Roma is carefully avoided by the rhetoric of common law, as in Bordeaux. But if institutions and NGOs are obsessed with Roma, if only to help them, those so designated do not care, do not challenge the categorization. They do not frontally attempt counter-speech, nor dispel the misunderstandings. Nevertheless, they do not remain passive. On the basis of our analysis of the logics of integration implemented in this project and the gap between the ways Roma are seen and the way in which they live, we can see the space available for these migrants to preserve or develop leeway in a highly normative and constraining context. We'll show that the practices by which they punctually neutralize the pitfalls of social relation asymmetry with the professional of these projects, and then we'll see that this leeway is never claimed or explicated as such, and the resistance to the injunction which it signifies is more or less powerful. We propose here a crescendo analysis, starting from 1, hidden forms of resistance, then 2, direct negotiation with the social workers, to examine 3, the affirmation of a certain opposition by living kind of double life. So, a first leeway for the beneficiaries is at the heart of their discursive practices, without ever presenting itself as a form of reaction to external injunction. As shown by James Scott, speeches like rumors and gossip can be considered as practices of daily resistance against domination. Indeed, rumors and gossip are extremely present in the daily lives of beneficiary families, but also in those of social workers who perceive pieces of them. By criticizing them, or by constantly commenting on their actions and their personal motivation, Roma migrants put social workers and institutions at a distance. Gossip also has an essential function within the framework of the relations maintained in the social grouping of the migrants. They create a collective connivance, but also in the relation with the actors of the project, because they make it possible to preserve themselves from situations of domination. At the same time, these forms of discourse protect those who manipulate them without ever compromising their loyalty. Indeed, the rumor belongs to nobody, and everyone can take hold of it without ever being incriminated, since it's always a question of already heard. Feeding gossip and rumor by repeating them in an innocent way allows Roma migrants to take part in these forms of invisible protest while playing the game of institution. Migrants also implement other means, more personal and situational, aimed at creating leeway within the project's frame. They do this always in a hidden way, while giving the workers an obedience and even an active submission to the project's rules. This is done through silences, small lies, or omissions that migrants do. This positioning comes down to keep a low profile within the projects by clearly playing the game of institution without opposing the multiple injunction. Another observable leeway for beneficiaries is to engage in direct negotiation with projects actors in order to combine some of their priorities with those of the institutions. This cannot be done by all migrants because of the subjective assessments of professionals. This cannot be done with all social workers for the same reason, but on the part of migrants. And this cannot be done on any subject. These negotiations also rely on the perception that these migrants have of the logics and the functioning of these integration projects. These negotiations sometimes also rely on the collective as a resource. This is particularly the case when migrants try to negotiate the taking into account of the 3-generation cohabitation in their rehousing, which is officially designed on the basis of the nuclear family. Or when they try to make social workers understand the necessity of a temporary stay in the country of origin, for sociability, for economic reasons, etc. While this may be prohibited in the project context. It's often a form of calculated and pragmatic negotiation. Migrants know what is contextually possible to negotiate and what is not, according to their interlocutors and situation. The scope of negotiation is increasing, especially as social workers are obliged to obtain results in an unfavorable institutional and financial context. The arrangements between social workers and beneficiaries thus become a way for both to maintain together leeway and their respective autonomy, while sometimes drastically reducing the asymmetry of their relationship. Then the beneficiaries can thus try to maintain the priorities which are at the heart of their existence, either thanks to their participation in the projects or in spite of this participation, or even without taking into account the constraints linked to their inclusion in the projects. Indeed, some people involved in these projects implement a compartmentalized organization of their daily lives, which clearly distinguish the logics of the projects and their own logics. They then live kind of double life, agreeing to institutional and personal requirements. These double lives led by migrants are motivated by the necessities. On one hand, to combine the good, the real life, as they understand it subjectively, with the requirements of public hospitality projects. And on the other hand, to respond to the paradoxical injunction that characterize the projects themselves. Consequently, without being impermeable to institutional requirements and constraints, the beneficiaries of the project do not become passive recipients. It is for these migrants to preserve their autonomy and their free will while composing with a constraining environment. The effective autonomy of the beneficiaries can therefore only be maintained and developed by playing on misunderstandings in order to get out from forms of domination based on a negation of their quality as subjects.
Conclusion. In conclusion, our fieldworks led us to underline the role and value of informality and productive misunderstandings, even quiproquo, in the processes of effective integration taking place in a strongly binding context, as we see. Indeed, these migrants manage to consolidate their administrative situation, to develop their local integration through housing and economic activities, etc. But they do it in their own ways, which correspond to a more flexible and pragmatic integration modalities based on daily sociability in and out of the social grouping, and therefore these modalities are far removed from the integration model promoted within the project. From this perspective, the general rhetoric of inclusion that we all know very well, referring to an ideal society that does not exist outside the upper middle classes, is probably not conducive to a better understanding of the dynamics of integration, effective integration at work today, with Roma migrants as for everybody, in fact. And before trying to empower people, it may be useful to understand how people are already empowered locally and concretely. And this means accepting the fact that this empirical and effective power and the strategies employed do not always coincide with our own ways of experiencing the world. Thank you.